Okay, let's kick off by asking you about Wang Li and Antony Blinken. Are they going to meet here?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it hasn't been announced, but I can't imagine they're in the same building and they're not going to meet. And clearly, President Biden wants them to meet. Xi Jinping, if you saw the escalation, that we've seen, it's been complaining, but nothing that is meant to cause problems with the United States. I think that that's going to be one of the big positive signs that comes out of today's summit.
Is it all hot air?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot higher. Why'd you go there? No, look, this is, if it hadn't been made public, they were still going to do the meeting. And not only were they going to do the meeting in Beijing with Xi Jinping, but they weren't going to knock down the balloon. So everyone understood in the administration this was not a proximate intelligence threat. This is a backup plan for the Chinese to have surveillance in case, if there is a conflict with the United States, they lose their satellite capabilities. And with Taiwan becoming more chippy, people are worried about that. We are right to say we're not going to tolerate it going forward, but it became a much bigger deal once it became public. By the way, just like that Pelosi visit.
No doubt.
To Taiwan.
When you think about this a bit more broadly, obviously we're talking about China here, but we're going to also have to focus on the situation in Ukraine. To your mind, are we any closer to getting both Finland and Sweden into the NATO alliance?
Yeah, we're closer. I think...
Because I've been talking about that with the Secretary General for months.
For a long time, yeah. And I mean, they don't necessarily go in at the same time, even though they have been coordinating their bids since they requested membership formally. Keep in mind, Erdogan in Turkey is dealing with a very tough re-election and a horrifying human tragedy, and there is aid from all of the NATO allies on the ground in Turkey. He is, after the election is over, assuming that Erdogan wins, he's probably going to be a little more flexible on this issue. I don't think this is going to be a huge problem.
What about Iran? They're not present at this conference. We've seen them so often.
Right now.
Well, we've seen them so often here in the past. Is it a mistake, in your mind, not to have a representative from Iran?
It's an inevitability. It's not a mistake. The Iranians are considered rogue states by NATO. The Russians are considered the most powerful rogue state in history by NATO. So, I mean, literally, the fact that we have these two countries, one of which has 6,000 nuclear weapons, the other which has become the principal challenge to the U.S. and its allies in the Middle East, not present at the Munich Security Conference, implies that the global order is more dangerous than at any point since the wall came down. That's where we are. This is not westlessness that you and I talked about 3-4 years ago, the theme of the conference. There's a lot of westfulness happening at Munich Security Conference, but some big countries are not a part of it. They're principal enemies, and that's only escalated.
Okay, talk to me about the global south, because there is representation from folks in my part of the world, the Middle East, the broader Southeast Asia area as well. But there are big questions about whether or not they are really going to be moving forward in the same way as the West, because you have 40 countries sanctioning Vladimir Putin, and at the same time the rest of the world sitting back and saying this isn't our fight.
No, Hadley, there are no big questions. They are not with the West. And why would they be? I mean, the West has shown they're prepared to give $100 billion for fellow white folks in Europe. They are not prepared to give that. I mean, they've made $100 billion pledges for the global south for climate over the past years, haven't made good on that. A lot of talk about Ukraine, not much talk about the Palestinians that are much more of a priority, or the Ethiopians, or so many other countries that they are more concerned about them. And so, look, I'm deeply concerned about Ukraine, but the revealed preferences of the West are that the global south doesn't actually matter. We'll give them a lot of lip service. We won't do very much for them. And as a consequence, when we are telling them we want you on board on Russia, they're saying business as usual, whether that's OPEC Plus in the Middle East or whether it's, buying lots of commodities and trading and doing military exercises with the South Africans, the Indians, who are supposed to be America's strong strategic friend, part of the Quad. They're doing as much with the Russians right now as the Chinese are. So there's almost no one in the global South that is with any of NATO when it comes to Russia.
But doesn't that just then underline the fallacy, which is that the West is frankly leading the way when it comes to the future of democracy and the future of governance in the world? Because essentially the program here is called revision. It's about revision of the global order, and half the world isn't talking about it, or at least they're not here.
Well, the fact is that the West and democracy was seen to be under threat for the last years. NATO was seen to be brain dead, according to Macron, and obsolete, according to Trump. No one's talking about that anymore. So what we do have is a more cohesive NATO, a stronger and better governed European Union, We also have a G7 that actually stands for something. Now, that matters in terms of the global economy, of course, the role of the U.S. and global reserve currency, but it's not a majority of the world's population. So what we have is more fragmentation. What we have is globalization with more sand in the gears. We don't have global leadership, but we do have a West that increasingly knows what it stands for, and perhaps more importantly, knows what it stands against. And that's what you're going to be experiencing here in Munich over the next 2 days.
And then in terms of those autocracies, do you think that that is going to perhaps drive a wedge in between the West and my part of the world, the Middle East, the Gulf Arab countries, UAE, Saudi Arabia? Their largest foreign direct investor, as you very well know, is China.
Well, when Biden goes out and says that Russia is about global democracies versus global autocracies, that is not a message for American allies in the Middle East, right? I mean, maybe a bit for Israel, but certainly not for the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the rest. And the fact is that you talk to
what are they supposed to take from that other than exactly what he said?
They're supposed to, they can take lip service, and then it's really meant for domestic policy, and certainly they do a lot of that themselves. So they're big boys, and they're all boys. They get it, right? But if I think about who they see as their future, they see China as their future. Xi Jinping's trip to Riyadh was, I mean, there wasn't a fist bump, but there was everything else. And they're certainly talking much more about how to align towards Chinese investment, towards the Chinese consumption market, industrial market, even over time, perhaps, shifting some of their pricing of energy towards RMB, which will make a big splash when it happens. There's a lot of pressure in that direction. I heard a lot about that when I was just there. Absolutely.
And final question for you, just in terms of the message from Ukraine. Obviously, President Zelensky has done a phenomenal job of keeping Ukraine in the headlines. I don't think that there is a conference that you and I have attended in the last year where he wasn't beamed in by a satellite or has just shown up himself. In your mind, exactly, right.
Yeah, exactly.
In your mind, where do we go from here at this point? Because I'm speaking to the Ukrainian foreign minister this weekend as well. Sure. We're going to be talking about weapons. We're going to be talking about the big asks that Ukraine is still making of the West and will continue to make, no doubt. But in terms of what happens next, there are questions about corruption. There are questions about the billions of dollars that are going to be finding their way into the pockets of those in Ukraine. And frankly, even people on the ground there say that they're worried about a misuse of funds.
Yeah, the questions aren't principally about a misuse of funds. The questions are principally whether or not Ukraine continues to have the kind of attention and cohesion from the West that it's had for this first year. This is an existential crisis for Ukraine. It's an existential crisis for Zelensky and his family personally, right? They're fighting literally for their lives. Ukraine can lose this war. Right? I mean, the extraordinary outpouring of support from NATO is well beyond what anyone would have thought possible. Whether it's the Germans being able to just cut off Russian energy over the course of 12 months and look like they can do it permanently, or whether it's the United States taking the lead militarily, technologically, in protecting the Ukrainians and giving them almost everything that they could use to help courageously defend themselves against the Russians. But will that be true in a year after debt limit crisis in the United States? Will it be true in 2024 with upcoming presidential elections? And we don't know what's going to happen there. The answer is Ukraine can lose. Everyone here needs to understand that Ukraine can lose this war. The big geopolitical challenge is that Russia can't win. I mean, they can win in Ukraine, but they can't win globally. They can't win in terms of NATO because they will still be a pariah. They will still be cut off. NATO will still expand. And for Putin, feeling humiliated, insecure, and in a vastly worse geostrategic position than he was before he invaded, what's he going to do as the world's most powerful rogue state? That's a long-term question that goes well beyond Ukraine.